Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. Linode is sponsoring us this week. Check them out at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual service for your next project. We are also sponsored by Sentry this week. Stop hoping your users will report bugs. Sentry's real-time tracking gives you insight into production deployments and information to reproduce and fix crashes. Check them out at getsentry.com. Visit our site to subscribe to our show, sign up for our newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And to help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes, Google Play Music, or tell your friends and coworkers. You can visit discourse.pythonpodcast.com for your opportunity to find out about upcoming guests, suggest questions, propose show ideas, and discuss the show with other listeners. Your hosts, as usual, are Tobias, Macey, and Patti. Today we're interviewing Augie Fackler about the Mercurial version control system. So, Augie, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I've worked on Mercurial for something like 8 years. Used to live in Chicago and now live outside Pittsburgh.
So, how did you get introduced to Python?
While I was an undergrad, I got an internship, and I knew Objective-C and Java and kind of knew Perl. And they basically said, well, show up knowing Python. If you don't know Python, your internship could be real short. We're going to mail you a couple of books. And so I rewrote some software that I was playing with in my spare time in Python, and that's how I got started in Python.
So, can you describe what Mercurial is and how the project got started?
Yeah, so Mercurial is a version control system. So hopefully everybody who's listening is using one of those, whether it's Subversion or Git or Mercurial. The way Mercurial got started was back in 2006 or so, the Linux kernel had been using BitKeeper. And for a variety of reasons that I won't go into, there's a long colored history there. The Linux kernel had to stop using BitKeeper. And so Git and Mercurial both came into being, I think it was in April of may have been April of 2005, now that I think about it. But in any case, they needed a new version control system, and they wanted something that was close enough to the workflows they'd come to like out of BitKeeper that Git and Mercurial look very similar if you squint just right. And that's where both of the projects came from. And Matt, the founder of Mercurial, actually used to be a Linux kernel developer full-time. Or I guess full-time.
That's really interesting. I knew that Git was started originally for the purpose of tracking the Linux kernel source code. I didn't realize that Mercurial was spawned from the same need. That's interesting. And it's also sort of speaks a little bit to why some of the workflows, as you said, are somewhat similar, although they are, fairly divergent, particularly these days.
Yeah, it's less divergent than I think most people expect even today. The real big divergence is once you start getting under the covers. The data storage models are astonishingly different for tools that look so superficially similar.
I think in terms of the BitKeeper Git thing, I think it's like Augie said, Linux for a while at least, the kernel was in BitKeeper. And then, Augie, didn't BitKeeper go proprietary? Or maybe that was in the colored history that you were...
Yeah, so BitKeeper was always proprietary. BitKeeper, I think, was the outgrowth of some source control ideas that originated at Sun in the 90s.
Right.
And BitKeeper had always been proprietary. Yeah, I've heard a couple of different versions of history, and I don't know which one is right, so...
I remember that the Linux kernel project used BitKeeper for a while, and I just remember I was pretty heavily involved with the Linux community even back then, not as a committer or anything, but just in terms of as a rabid fanboy. And I remember the massive hue and cry over the need to switch because of BitKeeper's proprietary nature. There were other things. There was dissatisfaction with its model, and I seem to recall complaints about it not scaling or something like that. There was a whole raft of reasons around why BitKeeper wasn't, according to some people anyway, doing the job. And I remember Git coming around not too long after that.
There were also some people who were displeased that it was a proprietary version control system, and that kind of precipitated some events that led to the license for the Linux kernel being revoked.
So how did you get involved with working on the Mercurial project?
Yeah, that's kind of a funny story. You can make a claim that my entire career working on Mercurial as a yak shaving expedition from my previous company. So a teammate of mine at that company showed me Git SVN and was doing all this neat stuff with Git SVN and set me up with it. And I think I burned myself 4 or 5 times in the first 2 days getting the Git repo wedged such that he couldn't help me get out of it. And I was in over my head. And so I had seen how useful the workflows were, but was too frustrated by the tool, and remembered, because I have some friends that were early Subversion committers and had worked on Subversion in the past. They had told me that Mercurial seemed like it was doing pretty well, so I kind of cobbled together in bash scripts a hacky version of what eventually became HG Subversion, and in evenings and weekends slowly turned Mercurial into a really powerful Subversion client that served my needs at my last company where I was using Subversion all the time, and just kind of kept getting in deeper from there until now I'm here and I kind of work on version control stuff for a living.
One of my first introductions to Git was actually trying to convert a few Subversion repositories to Git so that we could push to GitHub, which was then in its early days, so that we could have a slightly more sane approach to how we were managing our source control, because the company I was at was small enough that it didn't make sense to have a centralized repository a la the Subversion model.
Oh, we had a centralized repository, but I discovered that it was running an ancient, vulnerable to known CVE's version of Subversion when I was writing HG Subversion, because I found that the server didn't actually understand some of the newer wire protocol commands in Subversion. It was interesting times. I ended up being the version control administrator because I was the only one that cared.
And what are some of the features that can be found in Mercurial which are lacking in similar tools such as Git or Bazaar?
Yeah, Bazaar is an interesting one. I haven't actually used Bazaar at all, and they have, to my knowledge, basically thrown in the towel and said that no further development work is being done. Just kind of sad. Features, though. So we have a structured query language for revision history called revsets, and a related one for file trees called filesets. That was the kind of thing where Matt had the idea and crafted the initial implementation and showed it off, and everybody thought it was really neat when we first looked at it, and I think a day and a half later it was like oxygen to everybody. We just couldn't live without it. And even now when I'm using Git on a project that's using Git, I get very frustrated that I don't have rev sets usually within a day or two. I don't know how much I use them until I don't have them. We have a fairly nice templater. I asked a colleague of mine who's working on some Mercurial stuff right now and used to contribute to Git, at least somewhat, what he thought was good, and he brought up the templater is really, really nice. And also we have a concept called phases. So we have this notion of whether a change is public, draft, or secret, and that kind of helps you avoid screwing up history edits. I think within 2 days of phases existing as a thing in Mercurial, it prevented me from screwing up a rebase.
And so would phases allow you to have a workflow where you are committing locally and pushing to a remote repository, but you have them marked as secret so that if you were doing the equivalent of a git commit -- amend, you wouldn't be negatively impacting anybody else who may have happened to have started working against those change sets that you had posted to the server?
Sort of. What you've described is actually the leading edge of a project we've had going on for a while, which is actually why we have phases that we're calling change set evolution, where we're actually tracking the metadata of this change replaces that change over there. And so you can record that metadata for things that are drafts, and then you can exchange the metadata about what changes replaced what other changes along with these draft changes. And then if you have work that's based on mine, the tool can help you deal with your descendant changes from mine.
And then for the rev sets, can you compare and contrast that a bit with the reflog from Git?
Yeah, so they're completely unrelated for the most part. So the reflog in Git is a journal of where like master has pointed. So if you do reset -- hard, you'll end up with a new entry in the reflog, and you can like go look and see where master used to point. And if you did a rebase, you can look at the intermediate states there. Rev sets are a straightforward search query system. So if I go to selenic.com/hg, there's a search box in the upper right hand corner, and that actually accepts a restricted subset of the revset language, all the things that we can actually run on a server that are safe. And you can look for all the changes that Matt made in version 3.7, between 3.7 and 3.8. See, is there a way I can send you guys a link here in Skype?
You can just put it at the bottom in the links section there.
Great. So that's a sample revset query. And so the 3.7 : 3.8 means revisions that are topologically between 3.7 and 3.8. And that's inclusive. And then the and user npm means that if the username field has a substring npm, it'll match. And so you can see, if you look at the link, it actually returns only the changes he made in that part of our history. And that it looks like a gimmick when you demo it. And then like you start coming up with little places where having a structured query language is awesome.
No, I can totally see it, because it seems like Mercurial is in a sense embedding the functionality that used to live in tools like the one Atlassian made that was like code search or Grok or things like that, where you wanted to be able to do rich queries on your SCM. It sounds like you're at least providing the basis for that kind of tool without a lot of external processing. That's fantastic.
Right. And the help doc actually describes all the, I'll put a link in for that too. That's the help doc for revsets, which you may as well link to as well, because that describes all the other search predicates. And then file sets are the same kind of thing, but over your files. So you can easily search for things like files that are larger than 10 megabytes and don't end in PNG, because we've all done that with find, and it's kind of a pain.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. So one of the common complaints with Git is that its human interface could use some work. How is Mercurial's UX an improvement over Git?
This was actually the sort of the last thing my coworker mentioned was argument order often doesn't matter with Mercurial, and with Git it often does. You can put flags anywhere, that kind of thing. And we try to think really, really hard about command line UX. I think a lot of people forget that just because you're on the command line doesn't mean you don't have a user experience. And it's really easy for that user experience to be unredeemably horrible. Git checkout does like 4 or 5 things depending on who you ask, because it also is what you would expect revert to be if you had used any version control system that wasn't Git. And Git revert is in fact something completely different, which is baffling to a lot of newbies.
That's definitely something I see with new developers, struggling like crazy with Git's interface. And I think it is exactly what you say. It's because they viewed it as this kind of, the command line is this necessary evil sprinkled over the top of Git's amazing internals. Whereas I think it's really unfortunate that a little more thought wasn't put into it, because I think that there have been hundreds of thousands of developer hours lost to people who really just don't want to have to care that much about their SCM frustratedly.
And that's actually where revsets come from. So we had this thing called the parent rev spec extension that stole a couple of Git's sort of line noise operators for looking at history. Like you can do git log master caret, and that gives you the first parent of master instead of master as the reference you're referencing. And that's useful, but it's not ideal, because that only lets you do a couple of things. And they've snuck a lot of really clever operators in through this sort of line noise thing. And there's this thing that I've only seen referred to as the Git pickaxe. I don't actually know a better name for it. People have blogged about it, and they have a bunch of git log takes a zillion flags, because there's a flag for every kind of search you might want to do. And instead of accepting these knockoff flags one at a time as we wanted the functionality, Matt thought really hard and played the long game and said, instead of giving you all of these flags, I'm going to give you a query language that you can then use any place you want to talk about a revision, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's definitely better to have a more uniform approach to it than having a particular corner of the tool that you can do that, powerful querying, but everywhere else you're hamstrung and don't have that full flexibility. And having tried to parse through how to actually do some different analysis in the, git log command line, I can definitely appreciate being able to have a much more rich syntax for being able to pull out that information.
Revsets are one example, but another, mostly what we do is we look at new functionality, and new functionality has to justify itself as baggage you want to carry around for the next decade. We're talking, Git and Mercurial are software projects that are over 10 years old at this point. And if a piece of functionality can't justify itself on a 10 to 20 year kind of lifespan, it's probably not worth keeping. We say no to a lot more features than we say yes to.
Yeah, because once you include a feature, it's impossible to actually get rid of it without upsetting a lot of the users of the tool.
So our backwards compatibility policy is that we don't break backwards compatibility unless it was a bug, with I think one exception I can remember in history, which was about command line flag positioning parsing on an obscure corner of the tool.
That seems like a legitimate reason for breaking backwards compatibility if it was severely unintuitive.
Right. So it used to be that you couldn't put flags after positional arguments, and that changed something like 8 years ago.
And it seems to me that perhaps this sort of strict adherence to the long game, the long view, would be made much easier by your explicit inclusion of an extension mechanism. So, you ask for feature X, Mercurial says no, but then you can go off and write an extension to do what you want anyway, so everybody wins, and the integrity of the overall project is maintained.
Right. And so HG subversion is not something that is ever going to be part of core Mercurial because it's almost as big as Mercurial in terms of line count, or was when I looked at those stats like 5 years ago. It's incredibly valuable. A lot of people like it, but it's also bananas, and we don't want to support it in the same way we want to support the core Mercurial product. It does a lot of really strange things. And there's other stuff that comes in through extensions too, like Facebook has this remote file log extension that makes their clone times, instead of being insane, be fine, and also speeds up rebase and some other stuff. And that was something we probably wouldn't have tinkered with at all upstream if they had asked, but because they can just do an extension and swap out the storage primitives, there it is. Here's remote file log. It seems to work. And it's got a pretty good installed base, and some other places are also using it.
I'm guessing the large file extension is another example of that, talking about swapping out low-level storage primitives.
Yep, that I don't even know where that originated, and then I think the Kiln Harmony people picked that up at one point and sort of polished it and got it to be a lot less of a mess, and now it's something we ship in mainline Mercurial, which is great.
Speaking about its extensibility and flexibility, can you describe some of the internal architecture and some of the design choices that allow for it to be so flexible and extensible?
Yeah, a lot of it's just about having conscious layering in the tool, and there are places where the layering is not as good as we would like. Our class that is a repository is kind of a god object and really needs to be smaller and do less things. And we've been slowly moving that, but in general, there's this layered architecture. So the lowest level piece is a file structure called a revlog, and that's where all the data for revision history gets stored, and the changelog and the manifest gets stored in a revlog too. And then there's a layer above that knows how to interpret the relationships between a manifest and a file log, and how to chase this path at this revision is in a revlog that I can find here. And then at a layer above that, you start gluing on more interesting business logic around creating new commits or running verification over the repo. And then on top of that is a layer of commands that can execute using all of the lower level data types. So a lot of extensions are just, here's some new commands. That's most of what HG Subversion does. It has a couple of features where it's, say, wrapping the diff command so that you can have diff output diffs that look like they came from the SVN tool, because it turns out there's a subset of tools that parse SVN's diff output and are extremely picky about, say, the white space characters in the diff. Some things are very monkey patch heavy, so large files is a good example of that. Remote file log is another good example where they sort of inject themselves into part of the tool and then provide the same interface as the original implementation, but with some different storage backend or that sort of thing.
Speaking again about some of the translation layers between Mercurial and other source control, I know one of the more popular ones is GitHG that allows you to actually use Mercurial as a Git client. So I'm wondering what functionality of Mercurial gets lost when you have to translate to and from the Git sort of semantics and data structures. So in using Mercurial as a client, what are some of the things that you should watch out for so that you don't accidentally put yourself in a situation where it will no longer translate cleanly to Git?
Yeah, named branches are something that don't have an analog at all in Git because they're this indelible label that get baked into the change when you commit it, whereas a Git branch is just a movable pointer that's not actually part of history. Rewriting history kind of gets a little weird, but to be honest, I haven't used HGGit in several years. It it interacts sufficiently poorly with Garrett code review, which is where I've had to send enough patches that I just kind of got frustrated with it. I keep it on life support, but I don't use it for anything but sort of casual interaction. I do have a couple of friends that use it every day, and they seem to be pretty fine with it.
And are there any analogs with Garrett in the Mercurial space that you're aware of, or does Mercurial have any comparable workflow to what Garrett allows?
Garrett specifically, I don't know. There have been a couple of interesting code review tools kind of come and go. There's the Calithia project, which I think has its own pull request implementation now. I'll send you a link to that so that you can not have to figure out how to spell it. And Mozilla has done some work with the review board code review tool. That works pretty well. Fabricator's actually remarkably nice. I say remarkably mostly because my first reaction when I looked at it was, oh, this is written in PHP. I'm going to run away now. But we've been using it at work, and I've been really pretty happy with it. Nobody's quite doing code review the way I think they should. Not Garrett, not pull requests, but that's another topic entirely.
And in reading through the documentation and website, it mentions one of the core goals of Mercurial is for it to be safe. Can you explain what safety means in that context and how it is architected to achieve that goal?
Yeah, a big part of that is the principle of least surprise. So users shouldn't do something and end up getting burned just by having this foot gun that kind of destroys all of their work because they asked it to. Another big part of that is taking functionality that requires a significant amount of user thought and hiding it somewhere early on. So rebase is off by default because if you rebase things that you've exchanged with other people, you kind of enter this world of hurt and probably are going to need somebody more experienced to bail you out. We're hoping that change set evolution will get us to a point where we don't have to hide some of this stuff behind the curtain anymore. And we have some things that aren't safe that we would like to take away, but our backwards compatibility guarantees mean we can't. We have this command called rollback, which you should never ever use, because it undoes the last transaction that we committed to the data store, which could be a pull, in which case it's not a big deal, or it could be a commit you did 2 days ago because you haven't committed since then, and then terrible things happen.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a frightening tool. Safety
is intertwined with usability. The more usable a tool is, the more safe it'll be by default, because people won't be guessing. They'll just make the right decisions on an informed basis and think things will guide them in helpful directions.
It's interesting hearing you say that rebase is considered a fairly risky operation, because over in Git land, rebase is considered almost, a way of life. Git pull -- rebase origin master is kind of prerequisite for doing a merge.
So it's risky just in the sense that if you've exchanged the code that you're about to rebase and somebody else is dependent on that, you could be bringing a world of hurt onto them.
Yes, that makes sense.
And our wire protocol, and this is also part of safety, our wire protocol out of the box doesn't have a way to exchange the deletion of history. So in Git, there's this notion of a force push where you can tell the server, no, I didn't mean it. Throw away what you have under the name master and replace it with this that I'm about to push. And we don't have a way to do that.
You shouldn't be doing that in Git either.
Yeah, except like when you have a pull request and somebody asks for some changes and then you need to rebase it so that it'll merge. Like it's something where Git definitely took the pragmatic approach. And if I was building a tool and had to make it work today, that's probably where I would go. We have the luxury of being able to be a little bit more deliberate and try and make change set evolution work. Because the metadata I was talking about with change set evolution a little earlier is really tricky to exchange efficiently. But if we figure that out, and one of our contributors thinks he's got it pretty well locked down, he just needs to write it down and run it through some test cases, we might be in a really good spot there. And then we'll actually be able to prevent sort of the force push accidental problem where you unintentionally force push to master and blow away a whole bunch of history.
Oh, yes.
That famously happened to Jenkins a few years ago. And what we'll be able to do notionally is you can make all of the stuff that's a permanent part of your project. So it's been reviewed and accepted. It will be in public phase, and then that's indelible through the wire protocol. Like you could still SSH into the server and screw things up, burn yourself that way, but you'd have to go out of your way. And then anything that's in draft phase is just that. It's a draft. It can change. It can get deleted. That's not a big deal. So a lot of this is what I mentioned before about playing the long game to try and end up with something better.
That makes perfect sense.
So one of the noteworthy aspects of Mercurial is, as we mentioned, there's a strong focus on making extensions a first-class concern in the project, so much so that a number of the actual core functions are written as extensions. Can you describe why that is and how the extensions plug into the core execution engine?
Yeah, some of the extensions are just extensions because they're kind of half-baked. We don't like them. So large files is sort of the unloved stepchild of core Mercurial, in that I think pretty much everybody who works on core hates it. And at the same time, we think it's really great when you need it. We have a wiki page called Features of Last Resort. Large files is one of the things that's listed prominently there, because most people that think they want large files actually want a better build system, because they want to do something like build a whole bunch of junk and then check in a built binary from the source code that it's going to live next to. It's easy to see how you end up with that as the solution. Like you have this thing that stores data pretty well, and well, all you have is a hammer, so I guess you're going to pound the nail.
Right.
But like you run into places that are doing really bonkers things with source control. I think at one point in the video game industry, it was a done thing to check in not only your source code and like your 3D meshes, which themselves are pretty big, but also things like the ISO of the particular version of Visual Studio that this was going to compile with.
Right.
The video game meshes and needing to check in ISOs and that kind of thing is more what large files is aimed at, not the I built a thing and it's really big and I don't want to do the build again because it's slow angle.
Well, I think that problem that you just mentioned, I somehow need to associate these multiple large blobs of binary data with, I need to put it in source control somehow. I need to be able to track it. And even if I can't diff it, I need to be able to say sort of, these are all artifacts that are considered to be part of this build or this tag or whatever the case may be. And while I totally agree that doing those kinds of things in your source code control system is perhaps not best practice, I've seen a number of situations throughout my career where the company just doesn't provide any other resources for tracking this kind of stuff. I mean,
right.
Sure, like you should probably be considering like an artifact management system like Artifactory or something like that, but maybe you don't have the resources for that, or you don't control the resources that you would need to create something like that. So what I've seen over and over again is people glomming these things into Git, where they just, drag down the performance of the entire repository horribly.
Well, and you get to tote along that 700 meg ISO for the rest of the life of that repo.
Yes, exactly.
So some things are in extensions just as a speed bump. So you have to go actually read enough about something to see the warning label that says, you don't want this. No, really, you don't want this. Okay, if you still think you want this, this is how you turn it on. Other things, Rebase and HistEdit. HistEdit is our knockoff of Rebase Interactive. Those are off simply because if you use them on exchanged history, you're kind of in for a world of hurt and or confusion, but most people turn them on. Progress was off by default for a long time because it had some unresolved issues, but now it's just part of the core product. Color is off by default because it's kind of invasive, and I think it might still cause problems on Windows, but I don't have a Windows machine, so I don't know. Other things are in extensions just for historical reasons or as examples. I think we have one thing still in HGX just as, here's how you can write an extension. Oh, EOL is another feature of last resort, so automatic end-of-line transformation between platforms. So Windows users see Windows line endings and all your other users see Unix line endings. Shelve is in the extensions area because it's still a little bit goofy in terms of implementation, and we'd like to sort it out before we kind of promote it to be a first-class thing that we think everyone should use all the time.
What are some of your favorite extensions to use, whether they're shipped in the default distribution or ones that you install as extra extensions?
So the color extension is pretty much a must-have in my opinion. It just makes the output a little bit more useful. HistEdit and Rebase, I think, are pretty great. There's a new one in 3.8 called FS Notify that uses a C++ binary called Watchman which abstracts away the different file system notification systems, whether you're on Windows, OS X, or Linux. And then it makes status all but instantaneous, pretty close to independent of the size of your repository. That was something Facebook decided to contribute upstream in the last cycle. And that's an extension right now because it's still kind of experimental. The last time we had something like this, it was a perpetual source of bugs, so we're a little paranoid. And then some neat third-party extensions. Remote file log, if you've got a really huge repo, lets you kind of have a sort of shallow-ish clone, lazy loading file contents. And then HG Subversion and HG Git. I use a lot less than I used to because most of the work I do is actually in Mercurial now. But I still occasionally will go and need to do some poking at something that's in Subversion, and I'll just grab the whole history using HG Subversion.
It definitely seems like Mercurial, in a lot of ways, is a more robust and flexible and, in some ways, advanced source control client than Git is. But it seems that a large part of the reason that Git has seen such large adoption is due to the prevalence of things like GitHub and GitLab. I know that Bitbucket exists for hosting Mercurial repositories. I'm curious if you know of any other noteworthy Mercurial hosting options, and if you think that the dearth of available options is partially due to the fact that Mercurial actually ships with a functional server built in as part of the distribution.
Yeah, I don't know. I actually attribute most of Mercurial's sort of marketing problems at this point to GitHub. I think that if the tools were compared in a vacuum, you could only use Git or you could only use Mercurial, no external anything. Mercurial would come out ahead pretty much every time. But the existence of GitHub, which sort of has social network-ish lock-in type effects because everybody's there, and you see the occasional comment on Hacker News where people are grumpy because a project isn't hosted on GitHub, and oh, I guess I won't bother contributing then. I really think that it's kind of a Mercurial versus GitHub competition, and that's kind of hard to win as an open source project because they're a pretty decent sized company these days. Bitbucket is a pretty good Mercurial host. I don't know of any others at the moment that are notable. Google Code was actually pretty good when they were still around, but they're gone now.
What about open source offerings? Something analogous to GitLab, maybe?
Yeah, Calithia's pretty good. I know a couple companies that are using that, and the built-in server is actually pretty good. For my own little server I have here at home, I use a thing called Mercurial-server, which is really just a thing that helps you craft the .ssh stuff correctly, so everybody connects as the HG user, and what they can access is determined by which SSH key they present, which is it's pretty minimalistic. And then for the things that should be public, I just run HGWeb in a standard WSGI container, and there it is.
There's another one that I had used a few years ago. I don't know if it's still around. It's called Roadcode. That was actually a combination of both Git and Mercurial hosting.
So Calithia is a fork of Roadcode.
Ah.
Roadcode went proprietary at one point.
Okay.
Or sort of proprietary. There's some inside baseball I won't get into there.
Certainly. Oh, yeah. And so for somebody who is completely sold on Mercurial and wants to convince everybody at their work that that's what they should switch to, do you have any advice or potential arguments that they could leverage to try and convince their coworkers and bosses that would be the right approach?
I mean, the biggest argument I'm aware of right now is just go find the Facebook blog posts about how successful it's been for them. They have a bigger repository than you do, almost certainly, because the entire Facebook web app is one big ol' repo and all of its dependencies. And that sounds kind of crazy and backwards to a lot of people, but mono repos are really nice. Having these big monolithic trees. Google gave a really good talk at a conference called At Scale last year, I think, about their monorepo. Mercurial is capable of handling repositories with more files in them than Git without getting painfully slow. So I think in Facebook's blog post they talked about rebase operations being 50. That's a 5 followed by a 0 times faster for their Mercurial users than for their Git users.
Yeah, and that's interesting given the fact that one of the common arguments leveraged by users of Git against Mercurial is the comparative speed on the smaller side of repositories because of Git being primarily written in C.
Yeah, and part of that's sort of unfair historical baggage in my estimation. There was a dark time when a lot of people installed Mercurial using easy install before pip was the done thing. And easy install for those who didn't live through that dark time, did a bunch of weird things with setup tools and like kind of mangled your site customize file in really, really weird ways. And so you'd have these people who were complaining that Mercurial was super slow. Like, it takes 2 seconds to do anything. And you'd go look at their system, and it was not that Mercurial was slow, it was that their Python interpreter was bogged down by all the gunk they'd installed. And so Mercurial was taking 2 seconds to do anything because 1.9 seconds of that was Python interpreter startup and processing site customize.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So like on my machine right now, if I just do Python-C print, that takes like 0.02 seconds, and time HG version is 0.1 seconds. So it can start up fast. It's just, if you do bad things to your Python, we suffer too, which is... Python has been both good for us and bad for us in places. That's one of the places where it sometimes hurts.
Yeah, and also in modern history, Python itself has gained a lot of speed boosts in various areas, including startup time, so I'm sure that has improved the story these days as well.
Yeah, that was actually why we didn't look at Python 3 at all until about 2 years ago. We would kick the tires periodically, and it would be a whole lot of infrastructure churn and things we didn't like, and then functionality that actually broke us, combined with much slower interpreter startup time. We were like, yeah, we're just going to not worry about this for now. So some of the changes that landed in 3.5, as I understand it, are because we and the Twisted project complained and said it is all but impossible to port our projects to Python 3. Please listen to us. We're not joking. And they finally listened.
What were some of those changes, out of curiosity?
The big one for us was being able to use the format operator on byte strings.
Oh.
So Mercurial is intentionally agnostic about the bits you're storing in it. We don't have a different delta algorithm for binary files versus text files or anything like that. Data is data, and we compute deltas and store them. So we don't actually know when you run hgdiff what text encoding the file is in. And worse, the old version of the file and the new version of the file could actually be different string encodings. So like you might have had a file that was Latin 1, and then it got turned into UTF-16. And UTF-16 actually looks like binary data to us, because it often contains a lot of nulls. It usually contains a lot of nulls. But if you ask us for a diff and you say, no, really, treat this as text, like, we still just need to print you a diff, and it's going to look like garbage on your terminal, but you get what you pay for, or something. And so it was actually really hard to convince the upstream Python developers, no, really, we need to print byte strings to the terminal. We need to do string interpolation with byte strings. We know what we're doing. Help. And we ran into the same thing with some of the OS path functions, like listing a directory. For a while, you could only give it a Unicode path to list, and it would only return Unicodes back. And anything that didn't parse from a byte string from the file system into Unicode using whatever decoding mechanism it was choosing, whether that was UTF-8 or something else, it would just silently ignore, which is catastrophic for us because in the Unix tradition, file names are opaque bags of bytes.
Right.
And it is possible but unlikely to have a repository that has Latin 1 file names and UTF-8 file names, and my very favorite string encoding for file names called Shift.jis file names. Shift.jis is notable because it's a widely used ASCII incompatible string encoding mechanism, and it's common in file names in Japan.
So, can you share some of the most recent features that have been added to Mercurial and some of the future plans?
Yeah, so some of the recent stuff, just looking at our release page for 3.7 and 3.8, we have a better delta mechanism that we finally turned on in 3.7. I think that had been in the code base for several years, but we kept finding little things where it made things worse, and finally that's done. Windows users will be glad to know that as of 3.7 we have wheel packages, so you don't necessarily need to be able to compile Mercurial yourself. A handful of other little things there, and then 3.8 was actually released like 2 days ago. You actually want 3.8.1 because 3.8 accidentally didn't include a security vulnerability fix. CHG is now shipping with Mercurial, which is lets you run Mercurial as a long-lived server, and then you run a tiny C binary that just speaks to the long-lived Mercurial. So sidesteps the Python interpreter startup time problem entirely. Rebase got a little smarter about picking its destinations. There's some nice new toys in the templater about defining aliases for the templater. Copy detection is a bunch faster. Our JSON output should no longer be invalid in some random cases. We used the hypothesis library to fuzz our JSON encoding.
Oh, neat.
Yeah. Somebody managed to convince him to come to a sprint we had in London. I guess he's local to London, and he just started letting hypothesis run on our code base and started shaking loose a bunch of weird bugs. We actually used a similar thing to hypothesis called American Fuzzy Lot recently on our C code and found a probably exploitable bug in our C code. So we had to do a release for that about a month ago. I mentioned FS Monitor. That's actually pretty great. That's worth using pretty much all the time, as far as I can tell. There's an auto move extension that attempts to detect file copies and renames automatically when you commit, so you don't have to tell the tool, it just figures it out. It's a time-based release schedule, so not every release has a big headline feature.
Right, that makes perfect sense.
A lot of things going on behind the scenes right now for this sort of ridiculously large-scale repository problem that is becoming more and more prevalent and more places want to solve. So Facebook was kind of the first driver of that, and now there's some other people poking in the same direction. Where version control is going, I think a more hybrid model's probably coming. A lot of people don't really need the full distributed workflow. I mean, the popularity of GitHub is a testament to that in and of itself. Having the local history is nice. Being able to make local commits is basically like oxygen to me. I wouldn't really want to work without it. But at the same time, companies really just need one history and that sort of thing. I think we're really onto something with change set evolution too. I've been using the sort of pre-alpha version of it for 3-ish years. It was another one of those things that sounded kind of great when I first heard about it, and then when I started using it, it rapidly went from this is kind of great to I basically never want to use a tool that doesn't do this. And I'm hoping that we will do a good enough job with this that every other version control tool will rip it off. Either we'll achieve world domination because we have it, or everyone else is going to build it again. One of those two, I hope, happens.
So with regards to the hybrid model that you're talking about, one of the complaints I hear with regards to Git, and I'm sure Mercurial, is developers really just don't want to deal with the concept of having to maintain this locally kind of detached repository and then have to maintain the notion of origin and manage the push process or whatever the case may be. They really just want to think of it in terms of, I want to make my changes, I want to make my commits, and at the end of the day, I want to check it in. Do you think the hybrid model will return some of that simplicity to developers that they feel pushed away from with the DVCS?
I think we'll probably end up with some of that. Bazaar actually had a feature. I haven't used Bazaar pretty much at all, but one of the features they had, which I think was popular, was this notion of a bound checkout where as soon as you did a commit in that checkout, it just immediately pushed it as well. I think there's some value in that for sort of the more casual user of source control. There was a really interesting UX usability study done by some UX researchers that I can try and track down after we're done talking and send you a link, that basically watched users interact with their source control tool and figured out how they used them. And most users are fairly unsophisticated and only have a handful of commands they use. And it's sort of this spell book of things they know how to type. And if they get outside the lines that they're used to, they go to the person. And it's usually one person at an entire company or an entire team, if you're at a big company, that can bail them out and actually understands the tool. And so I think there's room for the centralized, decentralized split going away to an extent and having a lot of the complexity be more opt-in.
I think that makes a lot of sense because I think you're right. I think you really hit on something with regards to the very short spell book of cheat sheet of commands that developers want to use. And I think that's part of why I see them struggle so hard with adopting Git, because that's very hard with Git. It's very easy to wind up in a situation where your spell book doesn't have the necessary incantations. It's like, oh, now you have to do a complicated rebase operation and then massage your repository thusly, and then you can merge without conflicts. And developers just look at you like, really? Like, they really just do not want to deal with all this. The SCM is not something that they want to have to think about or wrangle with, really. They just want to be able to do their little thing, and which I kind of understand, right? I mean, they're subject area experts, and they want to be experts on developing code for their particular niche or application or whatever. They don't want to have to become DVCS experts, and I think that would actually be a step forward to make that possible.
Right. And for as popular as it is these days to hate on Subversion and malign Subversion for the terrible tool that it was, Subversion was a revelation when it came out, both because it was blindingly fast compared to CVS, which a lot of people forget, and also because the Subversion developers, and full disclosure, some of them are friends of mine, thought very carefully about every flag that got added to that tool. They understood, as I hope we mostly do in the Mercurial community, that every feature you add is an albatross. And I remember seeing discussions about, oh, we want to add a new flag to this command, and I think it's going to get used a lot, so I want to give it a short flag. So instead of --foo -bar, -F or something like that. And they started having this long thread on the mailing list about whether or not it was worth spending one of the 52 bullets. Right, because you with each command, you have 52 bullets in the gun for a one character flag, and when the gun's empty, it's empty. You don't get any of them back. There was a real concern about whether or not they could spend another one. I don't remember any more of the context than that, but that really stuck with me from when I worked on Subversion a little as a hobbyist.
I think Subversion did a lot of things really well, a lot of things very right, and I think UX is one of those things. And I think that's why companies moved from Subversion to Git. I've seen a lot of actually pushback from developers saying, Subversion works great, I love Subversion, and they don't care about the advantages that Git brings to the table, because very often the pain that Git solves is the giant merge that you have to do when, okay, now your release branch, it's time to merge back to, the main line or whatever the case may be. That was typically Bob who does the merges, or, one particular victim developer who had to get stuck with that work.
So, funny story about that. At my last company, I had HG Subversion basically working. And we had this rotation in our team where every sprint we were doing Scrum, or whatever Scrum means. We were doing something we called Scrum, right? Every sprint, somebody got to be the release manager. And by got to me, I mean had to be. And that meant you were doing all of the integration merges of the feature branches at the end of the sprint. And at some point, it was my turn, and we always budgeted, I think, 2 whole days to do all the merges for all the feature branches. And I think it took me about 45 minutes.
Wow.
And the PM looks at me and he's like, "What did you do?" And like, "Well, I did all the merges in Mercurial, and then did a little bit of poking, and then sank them all back into Subversion, and I'm done." And I accidentally became the guy that does all the merges because, well, it was quick, and at the time Subversion's merge logic was not as good as it is now, and so I was getting a better end result with no human interaction, and things were just working. As opposed to, if you did it in Subversion, it was going to be one branch at a time and kind of tedious and a bag of hurt. I think most of my team ended up using HG Subversion by the time I left the company. And as I was leaving, they were starting to switch to Mercurial, which was kind of funny, timing-wise. I never got to use Mercurial there, but I won the war, sort of.
So do you have any other questions that you would like to cover, or any other topics that you'd like to bring up?
I don't think so. The other thing that we've got coming in the future, I'm hoping, is a lot more upstreaming of stuff we've learned from big companies. Big companies are so nice as a developer tools open source project, because they can do things like take every single interaction with Mercurial and store it in a big old database, and then you can say, how often does this get used? How often does this get used? And then the user runs help immediately afterwards, and actually start figuring out what your rough edges are in a more structured way. So Facebook has a extension that tweaks a bunch of the default behaviors that I'm starting to look at as a guideline for ways we could have an opt-in flag to make Mercurial a little bit less surprising.
Yeah, that's definitely useful having that rich history from a number of different users all interacting with different portions of such a large code base.
Yeah, and it's a broad spectrum of users. You had users who refused to move off of Git until they had their one pet feature, which a handful of those we picked up in Mercurial. And you had users who, as you say, they want to do their job. They don't really care what the tool is. The tool's mostly in their way. And we got really good usability feedback from those users too.
So for anybody who wants to follow you and keep up to date with what you're doing, what would be the best way for them to do that?
I have a Twitter account that I don't use a whole lot. It's Duran42. And most of what I work on in open source is on Mercurial. I have a bunch of things that I want to have time for, but I never seem to.
So with that, we will move it on into the picks. For my picks today, I'm going to choose a book called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. I was listening to it as an audiobook and just recently finished it, and it's actually a really well done treatment of the history of Homo sapiens back from prehistory and, when we branched off of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man, and how we, the impacts that we had as we spread out into the world, both on the different native species and also the other humanoid species, and all the way up through to the modern era, taken through the lenses of sociology, psychology, economics, ecology. It's just a really well done book, definitely worth a listen, and it leaves you with some interesting questions to ponder at the end of it. And my next pick is going to be a keynote presentation by Vanessa Hurst for, I believe it was the Velocity Conference at O'Reilly. It's called Cultures of Continuous Learning. It's a pretty short video just talking about the benefits and some of the approaches taken to foster continuous learning in your organization and what it can yield for the people who work there. And I will pass it on to you, Chris.
Thanks. My first pick is a series of videos published by O'Reilly. As a Safari Books Online subscriber, I get this as part of my subscription. It's called Intro to Django. Not very creative, but it's a really, really great series of videos. The woman who does the narration is really very good. She's very clear, easy to understand. The videos are broken up into very sort of bite-sized chunks. It's perfect. It's very easy to work alongside her with the videos and build the examples being built. It's been really eye-opening for me. Great stuff. My next pick is a podcast from NPR PRX called Transistor. In each episode, it's a science podcast, but each episode is something really kind of unusual and or mysterious in the science world. Really, really good stuff. My last pick is also a podcast from NPR/PRX called Embedded. Each episode it's basically an investigative reporting podcast. Each episode delves into a really different journalistic experience, like gang violence in Guatemala or other things, other sort of it's just really, really good investigative journalism, like the kind of thing that you wish was going on television, but pretty much isn't. Really interesting stuff. Augie, what kind of picks do you have for us?
So I've got a couple of books. One is the tip of the iceberg on a series. Leviathan Wakes they're both science fiction books. This one is being turned into the TV series The Expanse, which is how I found out about it, and I've read all of them that I've been able to get my hands on from the library. And then the other book is Three Body Problem, which won one of the big science fiction awards recently. I don't remember which one. It's a translation of a Chinese science fiction book, and it's fantastic, and the translation is really well done. It brings you up to speed on all the cultural bits of Chinese history you need to know to understand the story's framing. Both of those are really good. And then a piece of software that I've been enjoying a lot lately is Prometheus, which is a monitoring package. I'll dig up a link for you for that because it's kind of hard to search for.
Yeah, I've come across that one. It came from SoundCloud, right?
Yeah, it's the least infuriating monitoring software I've worked with, I think. Monitoring software seems to be necessarily terrible on some axis, and this actually has not annoyed me too much.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us and tell everyone about your work with Mercurial and all the different benefits that it has to anybody who is fortunate enough to be able to use it. So thank you very much for that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your night.
Of course. You too.